Hey guys, BrandonioProductions here, and welcome to this tutorial in which I will be discussing how to use lists in VB.net. In this tutorial, I will be using Microsoft Visual Studio, and I'm going to be working in the .NET Framework 2.0. Also, I have a custom theme installed on Windows, so that may affect the way my application looks. Just keep in mind that yours may look different. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, there are several ways to hold multitudes of information in the programming world. One of which is usually referred to as arrays, which is a container of information with limited space. The other form of storing information is usually referred to as array lists or lists. In VB.NET, it happens to just be called the latter, lists. So today I'm going to be teaching you how to use lists to store unlimited amount of information and get it at a later time. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to do is we're going to be making, let's just say, a small small little program that keeps track of employees at a workstation. So the first thing we actually want to do is, let's just say we want to keep track of employees' names. So we can get started with actually keeping track of these employees' names by adding a text box and a button. So this text box will actually be where we input the employees' names, and this button will be the submit button. Okay, and then we can press a button at the end to get all of the current employee names. So we can go ahead and get started right away. We've got our basic design going with a text box to insert the names, a button to submit the names that we're typing in, and this button, button 2, to actually retrieve all the names that we currently have stored. Now, I'm not going to retext these buttons at all because we know what they mean. So let's go ahead and get started by double-clicking on button 1, and let's edit the code for this. Now, the first thing we actually need to do is create a private variable that can be accessed by every control inside of the form. And this variable is actually going to be our list itself. So we're going to say private, let's just say employee list as, and the type of item that we're going to store it is a list. However, when creating a list, you need to specify what the list will hold. So in our case, since it's only holding names, we're going to make it a list of strings. Now, the next thing that we actually need to keep in mind is when making a list, you actually need to initialize the list before we can actually do anything to it, which means that we need to make the list a new list. Well, it's in good style to not initialize variables when declaring them as private variables. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to go to our form load code here, and this is where we're going to actually initialize the variable. So we're going to say employee list equals new list of string. So this is where we initialize the variable, and now we can successfully add and remove items from the list. So as soon as this button is clicked, all we need to do is add the employee name that's typed into the text box into the list. And this can simply be done with the list add command. So we can say employee list.add, and then we're going to, it needs a string, so we're just going to say text box 1.text. Alright, so now we have the basic code down to actually add an item to our list. But if we go back to our form, we have another button to code, and that's printing out all of the actual names that are inside of the list. So what we're going to do is double-click this button to actually access the code that occurs when the button is clicked. And in order to actually print out every name that is in the list, we are going to go ahead and use a for statement. Now, to make things easier, as soon as we add things to the employee list, we're going to clear the text of text box 1, so we're just going to make it equal to nothing. And so when button 2 is clicked, we're going to use a for statement to iterate through all of the actual employees in the employee list. So what we're going to do is we're going to type in for each name as string. So we're saying for each name in the employee list, and each element of the employee list is a string. So we're just reiterating that in employee list. So for each item in the employee list, what we're going to do is we're just going to say trace.writeLine name. So what trace is it actually simply prints out things to the console down below here. But if you do not want to do trace, then you can simply type in, you know what, to stay away from trace, to make things easier, we're just going to say dim name string as string equal to nothing, and then for each name inside of the employee list, we're just going to say name string equals a name string, and we're going to put a space and then name. Oops, we forgot the other ampersand. So we're just putting all of the names inside of a name string, and at the end we're just going to message box out the name string. So let's go ahead and test our application using lists. So we're just going to go ahead and run this, and we're going to add a few names to the list. So we're going to say Bob, and we're also going to add Dylan. Get it? Singer? Yeah? Alright. We're also going to add Brandon. That's my name. Tyler. Why not? Chance is a good name. Xavier is also a good name. Let's get some girl names going in here. Rose. Let's go Monica. Daisy is a interesting name. And Brittany. I don't even know if I spelled that right. So we've got a few names going, and since we pressed the button on all these names, it actually added all of them to the list. So if we go ahead and press button 2 now, we should get a message box that prints out all of the employee names, which we do indeed. So we typed in Bob, Dylan, Brandon, Tyler, Chance, Xavier, Rose, Monica, Daisy, and Brittany. So now that we know how to actually add all of these items to the list, we can go ahead and make a new function that actually removes items from the list. Now keep in mind that these items will not be stored when the application actually shuts down. So in order to do that, you're probably going to want to write all of these items into a text file and then read them back into the application. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're actually going to make another text box in our program, and we're going to have another button, and we're going to type in a name inside this text box, and then we're going to press this button to actually remove the name. So we're going to go ahead and code this button. So if the user types in something to the text box, the first thing we need to do to actually see if we can remove it is we need to see if our list actually contains the item that they want to remove. So we're going to say if employee list dot contains, and then we need the item as string, so that's text box 2 dot text. Then, so if the item contains the or if the list contains the name that we're looking for, we can actually remove it. So we're going to say employee list dot remove, and we can go ahead and just say text box 2 dot text. Otherwise, we are going to actually want to state that no such element exists. So basically, all of the functionality that you're going to need is already built into the list class. So if you want to add something, all you need to do is say add. If you want to remove something, all you need to do is say remove. And it's really simple. So we're just going to go ahead and test this out really fast. So we're going to start debugging and add a few names to the list. So we're going to say Brandon, go, Tyler, Olivia, and let's just type in Potter, like Harry Potter. And if we actually press the button, we get the 4 names that we went ahead and put in there, Brandon, Tyler, Olivia, Potter. But let's just say that Potter got fired because he's a wizard, right? He doesn't deserve to be working. So we can go ahead and actually delete his name. So let's just type in Potter and press button 3, and oh, we get the message box, no such elements exist. And why is that? Well, that's because I actually typed in Potters. And if we press button 2 here, we realize that we typed Potter into the list, not Potters. So we can go ahead and get rid of the S here, and then press button 3. And when we do, we don't get a message box, which means everything should have gone okay. So now if we press button 2 to print out everything in the list, we have Brandon, Tyler, and Olivia. We do not have Potter because we just removed him. So the list is also capable of a couple of other things, such as removing everything or organizing things by name if you want to do that. So we can, since string is a default class of VisualBasic.net, if you will, we can actually go ahead and sort the list in alphabetical order. That is because strings, when you compare them, they compare in alphabetical order. So we can go ahead and do this by every time we print out the list, the first thing we need to do is we need to sort the list. So we can say employee list dot sort. And that's going to go ahead and simply put the list in alphabetical order. So now if we start debugging and we say Xavier, add, Brandon, add, Andrew, Charlie, and let's just say we have somebody named Pumpkin. And if we go ahead and press button 2 now, everything should display in alphabetical order, which it does. A, B, C, P, X. Andrew, Brandon, Charlie, Pumpkin, Xavier. Okay, so that is another function of the actual list class. And however, since in lists you are actually able to specify what it contains, so we can say a list of string, a list of integers if we wanted to do numbers. You can actually create a custom class and have the list store that. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to right click on our project here and click add and then class, and we're just going to create a new item called employee. So just for ease of use, we're going to make each employee have a name and an ID number. An ID number is going to be the integer. So we can go ahead and make public accessors for these things. So we're going to make properties. If you get the property, it returns the name. Now, what properties are well, I don't think I ever actually went over properties. Property ID as integer. Return ID. So what properties are is essentially when you're using a control, like for example a text box, we can go ahead and go back to our form here. All of these things in which we see inside of this actually properties window are properties that we just programmed, like we just programmed into the employee thing. So in the employee class, every time you create a new employee, the name and the ID are both properties in which you can access from any other class. And since they're public, you can indeed access them from any other class. So what you have to do is you actually have to create a private variable to keep track of these properties. So we have a private name and a private ID. And usually when coding in VB.NET, private variables are preceded by an underscore in order to keep track of their privacy. So each of these properties, when you get the property, they return the private variable associated with them. However, if you set the property, they set the private variable associated with them. So we're just going to go ahead and minimize these properties because they're not important right now. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to create a simple constructor. So we're going to say public sub new. So keep in mind this is how you create constructors in Visual Basic.NET. And then when you create a constructor, you're just going to want to send it a name as string and a ID number as string. So byval ID as integer. And this is simply going to set name equal to the name that was sent in and ID equal to the ID that was actually sent in the constructor. So here's our basic employee class. All it does is store information. So now if we go back to our form, we can actually alter our list. Since instead of using strings just to store their ID or just to store their names, we're actually going to want to make these lists of employees. Employee. So now when we actually want to add, remove, or edit any of the list, it's going to throw us an error. So we're just going to go ahead and change everything. When we initialize the list, we want to initialize it as a list of employees instead of strings. And when we actually add something to the list, well, hold on. When we actually iterate through the list, we want to say for each name as employee. So now we're going to say for each emp, EMP for short for employee, as employee in employee list. So let's go ahead and go over the code here. When button 1 is clicked, this is when we want to add a new thing, a new item to the list. So all the list wants to do is add a new employee. However, in order to create a new employee, we actually need to create a new variable. So we're going to say dim employee as employee equal to new employee. A lot of employees. And then we need to specify the name and ID of the employee that we actually need to create. So the name is textbox1.text, which we specify, and the ID is it should be the number in which the employee was created. So for example, the first employee should have an ID of 0, second employee should have an ID of 1, going on from that. So the easy way to do this is actually to access how many employees there already are. So we can do this by typing in or getting this property directly from the employee list. So we can do employee list dot length or count. So this gets how many employees are actually already hired. So if we want to get if we add one employee, the first employee, it will return 0 as the count because there aren't any employees yet, and so the ID number will essentially be 0. So now that we created this new employee with a name and an ID number, we can actually add them directly to the list by saying we add the employee called employee. So the next thing we need to do is actually edit the code for button 2 when we actually display all of the information about the current employees. So employee list.sort, we're no longer going to want to use that because that's going to actually require us to implement a iComparable, and that's for another tutorial. So the first thing we're going to say is we're going to dim the name string as string, just like before, and we're going to sort through every employee in employee list. However, when we actually add the name string, or the employee to the name string, we need to directly access the name. And this can be done by saying emp.name. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add parentheses and then stick the ID number in there. So emp.id goes inside parentheses here. Okay. So now what we're going to be doing is we're saying it equals the current name string and then a space and then the employee's name, parentheses, and the employee's ID number. And then we're going to go ahead and just message box it out. And then our remove command, we actually need to say there are two ways in which we can actually do our remove command here. The first thing is we can actually allow them to insert a name or an ID, and it can delete it from there. Or we can actually no, let's do both. So they can insert either a name or ID into the remove text box, and that will be that. And we will remove it from there. So this will require a lot of intricate programming, not like what we had before. So if they insert an ID, the first thing we need to do is actually see if that ID exists. So we're going to scroll through each item inside of the employee list and check to see if the ID of the item matches the text box. So first we'll check for IDs. No, we'll check for everything. So we're saying for each emp as employee in employee list, if emp.name equals textbox2.text or emp.name or id.equals cint of val, returns double. So we're going to do cint of textbox2.text. Then we are going to emp dot or employee list dot remove emp, and then we are going to actually return here. So what we are doing here is we're scrolling through each employee in the employee list. And so since the user can either enter an ID or a name inside of this text box, we are checking each employee to see if the name equals the text box text or if the ID equals the text box text. But before we actually check if the ID equals the text box hold on, I just have some parenthesis issues here. So before we can check to see if the ID equals the text box text, we actually need to convert the text box text into an integer, and this can be done with the cint command. So if it either the name equals the text box or the ID equals the text box text, then we are just going to go ahead and remove the employee. However, once we do that, it will keep on scrolling through the list here and actually give us a concurrent modification exception. And we do not want that to occur. So after it actually removes the employee, we're just going to return, which essentially exits the sub here. However, if it doesn't return, then we actually never found an element that matches. So we're going to say no elements match. If it doesn't return, and then it will reach this point, and that means that there's no matching element. So we're just going to tell the user that. So now we can go ahead and actually test out our application. So we're going to go ahead and run it. And the first thing we want to do is we actually want to add some employees to make sure our ID function works. So let's remember the order. Just in order to remember the order, just to make remembering the order easy, we're going to put these in alphabetical order. So we're going to say Andrew, Brandon, Charlie, need to click the text box, Charlie, and Doug. So since we've added all those employees, we can go ahead and press the button 2 here, and as you can see, it prints out the name and then the ID number of the employees in parentheses. So that works as specified. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to test out to see if we can remove something that doesn't exist. So I'm going to type in Brandon's. And then if I press button 3, we actually have an exception here. Now, the exception is when we actually try to convert the text to an integer, if we type in a string, that actually does not work. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to try to fix this right now. So essentially, when you try to convert Brandon's, which is a string, to an integer, it won't work. But if you try to convert string numbers into an integer, I'm pretty sure that will actually function correctly. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to insert a try block to test for this. So we're going to say if imp.name.equals textbox2.text, then we're going to remove that. Else, so if that is not the case, then we're going to try, and we are going to say if emp.id equals cint textbox2.text, then we are also going to do the same thing. However, if that error occurs, then we're actually going to go here, and then we're just going to continue the for statement that we're inside, because that means that we can't compare the ID because they didn't enter an ID. Alright, so let's go ahead and start debugging this application once again. And we're going to add a bunch of names once again because they got deleted since the program was closed. Let's just go. So we can go ahead and test out the names again, and then we're going to enter the name Brandon's. And if we click button 3, we can see that no elements match. Now we actually see down below that it actually spit out a bunch of errors. But the reason it did is because it was constantly trying to convert text into an integer. Now, what we did was simply a workaround to catch to see if it was trying to do that, so it still displays these error messages. So now, if we actually insert the name Brandon, we can see that nothing occurs. There was no message box saying that no elements match, but if we actually spit out all the employees again, we're missing Brandon with an ID of 1, which is good. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to add Brandon back into the list, and if we spit out the contents, we now see that Brandon has an ID number of 3. So we have a little bug in which we have duplicate ID numbers, but that is okay because right now we're just going with a basic program, and these are kind of features that are being overlooked. So we can just go ahead and exit out of the application, get a fresh list going, and we're just going to add in a bunch of names again. This time we're only going to add in 3. So now if we spit out the names, we've got Andrew, Brandon, and Charlie with ID numbers of 0, 1, and 2. So let's go ahead and test out our ID number feature. So we're just going to enter an ID number of 2, and then we're going to press button 3. As you can see, we did not get the message box stating that no elements matched because we entered a correct ID number. So now if we press button 2, we can see that all that remains inside of the list is Andrew and Brandon. Andrew with an ID number of 0 and Brandon with an ID number of 1. Charlie with an ID number of 2 is now out of the list. So essentially, with lists, you can add an unlimited number of anything. You can also use lists to store various controls, such as picture boxes, or your own custom controls, or controls like or objects such as strings, integers, employees if you make that class. But was a very basic tutorial on how to use lists to store and manipulate items. So thanks for watching this video. I hope you learned something from it, and this should be very useful in the future. Please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe, and I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.